Hello and thank you for listening to Dragon Wagon Radio. My name is Jake Lloyd Bacon, co-founder of the network, just popping in briefly because it is that time of the year once again. March 2024 marks the 7-year anniversary of Dragon Wagon Radio. For 7 years, we've done the best we can to bring you the most professional podcasts possible. We continue to cultivate communities of people from all over the world, bonded by their love for a wide variety of topics. Dragon Wagon has produced 20 different podcasts, over 1,800 individual episodes with millions of downloads, all completely free to you. So we humbly ask, in honor of our 7th anniversary, that you consider showing your support and playing a part in keeping our shows free always. There are tons of ways that you can help. First and foremost, please check out our shop at dragonwagonshop.com. A fantastic collection of high-quality merchandise is available to you for reasonable prices. You can also visit our support page where you can find a link to make a donation directly and even an Amazon wish list. That's at dragonwagon.com/support. Some of our shows have individual Patreon accounts where they offer additional material. Please consider becoming monthly patrons if that's available. Additionally, leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify costs you absolutely nothing and goes a really long way to help. Lastly, consider sharing your favorite podcasts with your friends. Share clips or quotes on social media. Most shows have their own accounts, but you can also follow @It'sDragonWagon on all major social media platforms. So thanks again for another fantastic year, for being a dedicated listener, and as always, for being the best part of Dragon Wagon Radio. Happy anniversary, and here's to another great year of your favorite indie podcast network. Now let's get this show started. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to this very exciting episode of your favorite Shakespeare authorship mystery podcast. I welcome back to the episode a past guest. Most of you know who he is because his episode is one of the most downloaded episodes in the history of Don't Quill the Messenger. He is Luís Sousa, a true polymath. His accomplishments are many, including design of architecture throughout the world, engineering, master of musician and composition, multilinguist fluent in at least 5 languages, and so much more. Luís, welcome back to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Hello, Stephen. Thanks for having me back again, and hello to the listeners. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hopefully you will find something interesting in this, our talk.
So you have to make sure that the crazy designers don't create something that's going to fall down on people's heads. You're actually the guy who makes sure that the building stands up.
Let's put it. Yeah, that's a very well way of putting it. But you're walking on thin ice there because we have some very interesting arguments with architects, and basically we are the engineers. We are the people that are telling them they cannot have whatever they want because it costs too much money or takes too much time, or it's simply the laws of physics do not allow it.
The laws of physics
pretty
do
much
not allow it.
Pretty much like the Shakespeare mystery. Simply the laws of physics and logics do not allow for the great man to have been the author.
Well, you pointed out when we were setting up the date to record this episode that the topic that we're going to discuss today actually coincides with the date of recording. By the time listeners hear this, it will be a couple of weeks later, but we're recording on Friday, the 8th of March, 2024, which is actually recognized as International Women's Day. And how fitting, because today we're going to talk about the women in the life of Edward de Vere and how you can find those women present throughout the canon and in some very specific plays that you're going to talk about and share with us, in some very specific areas that you're going to share. But the major women we're going to be covering in the episode include Elizabeth de Vere, Edward's daughter. Of course, speculation whether she is his blood daughter or not, but he treats her like a daughter eventually through the latter part of his life. We're going to talk about, of course, his first wife, Anne Cecil, Elizabeth's mother. And then we're going to talk about his great love affair, Anne Vavasour, and then his second wife, the very formidable Elizabeth Trentham. And we may even dabble into Queen Elizabeth I a little bit. Wouldn't you say, Luís?
Well, definitely Elizabeth the first, not the second.
No, just the first.
It's just the first. I wouldn't know much about the second one.
No, me either.
Yes, as you say, Stephen, today, Women's Day, seems most auspicious to talk about the ladies of the Shakespeare canon, and we're going to cover all these ladies. I would like to do it in a completely different way and share with the public information that is completely new and has been undiscovered for the last 100 years. And for me, it's very surprising that such important and so obvious issues have been either neglected or misinterpreted. And by showing who these ladies were, I aim to prove today that there was only one man that could have been Shakespeare. And so this show goes out for the lasses, and perhaps I should give them a little dedication. So, well, ladies, thank you for your love, your beauty, your tenderness, your inspiration. And you know what? I even like the voices, especially when they reach the higher soprano register. And a little poem from Byron wouldn't go amiss, which is, the very first of human life must spring from woman's breast. Your first small words are taught you from her lips, your first tears quenched by them, and your last sighs too often breathed out in a woman's hearing. And this is very true. So 3 cheers for the lasses. Without them, human life would have no beginning, the middle would be devoid of pleasure, and the end without consolation.
That's very beautiful, Luís. I love that. And here. And so to all of you ladies out there, this one's for you.
Yes, I even know what you're thinking, Stephen. Ooh, Latins. It was only a matter of time till I turn as a Latin to women as the main subject. Well, of course, that goes without saying. and even as Don Juan or Don Giovanni in God Mozart's opera says towards the end 10 times, Don Juan, as a Spanish ancestor, he says in Italian, Vivan le femmine, viva il buon vino, sostegno e gloria d'umanità, meaning long life to women and hurrah for wine, the ground and glory of mankind. And yes, as the Italianate Earl de Vere was also very fond of the ladies, and through them we will definitely get to understand him better as a man and as an artist, and whether he indeed wrote Shakespeare or not. In order to do that, Stephen, we always need to start at the beginning, which is you need to get inside his head. Get inside of a person's head. You need to understand what makes him tick. Is it money? Is it power? Pleasure, possessions, women, art? What then? Now, I am not a poet. Even though I'm an engineer and a mathematician, I consider myself as a philosopher and a musician. But that should not prevent me from getting inside the head of a poet, because poetry, like philosophy, has knowledge. And like music, it has rhythm, tempo, and cadence. So my method and system is completely different from everyone that has traveled on this path. So for me, what always is most important is, after reading a book on Oxford or listening to a conversation, I ask myself 2 things, and this is my gauge to assess the merit of the discussion. 2 things. 1, how has this improved my understanding of the canon? And two, how has this improved my understanding of the man that wrote it? And even most of the times you don't get much from reading certain books because that it doesn't hold water.
I think you're right. And I think the interesting thing about where we are with the authorship mystery at this point in history is that there have been a lot of books written about it now. There is a growing library of subject matter associated with the authorship mystery that now exists, that has been developed over the last 100 years. And there are a lot of publications and there are a lot of papers and essays and things that are out there, and there are entire websites devoted to it now. But I think you're right. What happens, I think, is just like in any subject, there's a bell curve of quality with regards to what's out there. And some of it is not so good, and some of it is exceptional, and a lot of it runs across the middle. And it's very difficult then for people who are maybe new to this mystery or who are trying to find the best things to read about it. It's very difficult for them to sort of wade through all of that and find what's going to touch them best or inform them best. And I think it's one of the reasons, if I do say so myself, that this series has become so popular and continues to grow its audience, is because it's sort of a way to wade through all of that. And it's also easier to just listen to a podcast than it is to read a 500-page book as well. So I think that you're on to that quite clear, in fact.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. There are indeed books that I consider exceptional. My lifeline to this whole issue is definitely your show. I think you're entitled to congratulations for being so dedicated with this issue for the past 5-6 years, and hopefully today's episode we can achieve something good. I'm sure we will. Today also, just like in the last show, parental guidance is advisable. There's no need to read the speech because if we're going to talk about Shakespeare, sex is never far off.
Well, I often wondered, I wonder if you have an idea about this, Luís, because I've often wondered, Edward de Vere spent all that time. He went through France, Germany, into Italy. We have evidence that he made it to Sicily. For all we know, he may have actually popped over to some Greek islands at some point during that foray on into the continent. He traveled basically the entire length of the boot of Italy. And over that, 16 months, I think it was total, how many women shared his bed along that way? He obviously had a taste for the ladies, and that's very clear in the historic record, including, being thrown in the Tower for his dalliance with Anne Vavasour behind the Queen's back, and almost got them both executed over it, which I think is a big part of Measure for Measure, and I know you're going to get to that in a minute. But how many women do you think he had along the way through Italy? There had to have been women throwing themselves at this English earl, and he was so charismatic and so outgoing and, full of flair. And I wonder if he fathered any illegitimate children while he was in Italy. I wonder if there are any Italian families there that could trace their origins back to Edward de Vere's travels through the country.
Definitely, no doubt about it. Concerning the women that might have shared his bed, it's impossible to know, but definitely, if I were to say as many as he could, I don't think I would be far off. But this was a man that naturally had very high standards. Upon arriving to any new city, he would, of course, engage. It is an Italian custom. Whenever you go out of the time, let us not get into trouble whenever we travel now to Italy. It was a custom of the time whenever you arrived to a city to be accompanied with a lady that would also share your bed, and she would show you the place because she would be perfectly acquainted with the surroundings. Edward de Vere, definitely, as Shakespeare, is a very passionate man. He is quite fond of the ladies. And yes, although we have the record of these five and a few of these, the three or four, we have some record also of the ones in Italy. But Stephen, it's never good to look inside what goes on in between the sheets. Although sometimes we have to do it, just as in this case, in order to find out who the author was. But definitely a very passionate man, a true Latin man, and yeah, we're very fond of our fiery brunette beauties here in the south of Europe. And Shakespeare was also apparently very fond of the brunettes. So we know that the women in his life, the Shakespeare lasses, are based on real life persons, and they had a major impact in both the author's life and art.
Well, let's start with his first daughter, Elizabeth, who, as we mentioned, most likely, my belief is that he was not her actual blood father. I think he knew that. I think that's why he was estranged from his wife, Anne, for those 6, almost 7 years before he agrees to accept, to reunite with Anne and to accept Elizabeth as his daughter, to agree to Burleigh's cover story, his father-in-law's cover story, which is that he had been tricked into going to bed with his wife Anne prior to leaving on that famous trip to the continent. And so I think we know that Elizabeth de Vere is not Edward's biological daughter, but she becomes obviously a delight in his life. And I think that is demonstrated through her presence in the canon and all of the massive number of characters that involve what appears to me, quite frankly, as apologies that he makes to her over and over again through the plays and the female characters that he develops that are incarnations of her.
Yes, Elizabeth de Vere, we have to be very careful with the language we use when we say de Vere knew or we know. We should be very careful. De Vere, he suspected. He could not be absolutely sure, but what appears in the plays is definitely that this is a man that thinks that this is not his daughter. And he does it in a very intelligent way. Now, Elizabeth de Vere is a very extremely interesting character. On the last show, we talked about Macbeth and the rape of his wife. That was roughly 2 years ago. I don't have the need to retract anything. I maintain everything. I'm my biggest critic. If I had anything to retract for honesty's sake, of course I would do it. I still maintain my own opinion. Elizabeth de Vere is extremely important. She appears in the canon 3 times. I want to talk about these 3 times. And she is the daughter of Dudley and Anne Cecil, de Vere's first wife. Anne Cecil, of course, daughter of the much maligned William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. Actually, I have a very different opinion of Lord Burleigh. I think he was still a coward and he was just ripping off his wards. Still, he a very fine politician. He brought in the gold standard back to England. So it's actually quite interesting. By bringing the gold standard in a highly inflationary environment, that makes him probably the greatest politician of the last 500 years. So coming back to Elizabeth de Vere, he is in the canon. She is Miranda, she is Marina, and she is Perdita. Now, as Miranda, my work on the Tempest is extremely long and complex. In the last show, maybe we touched upon it like 3 or 4%. In order to understand why Miranda is Dudley's daughter, the author is putting her as Dudley's daughter, you need to be familiar with our Latin customs, especially the Italian customs and the Italian language. For example, let me give you one. Actually, Stephen, ironically enough, your American name leads itself more to Italian puns than mine own. So your last name, Sable.
Yes.
We would say Sabel.
Yes.
In Italian. Your lady wife, it would be Sabella. You are Sable, she would be Sabella, because with us, the A is feminine. The A denotes feminine gender, whilst the O denotes masculine. Then your daughter would be referred to as Sabellina. Sabellina, Ina being the diminutive, whilst your son would be referred to as Sabellino. As an actual case in point, there is a painting of my favorite Renaissance artist, Raphael, which is La Fornarina. Now, just this title tells you everything you need to know about the subject of the painting, because Fornarina, immediately you know she is the daughter, and Fornaro is a baker, because he works with the forno, the oven. So the subject of the painting is the baker's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how is Miranda related to Dudley? Well, Dudley was nicknamed by Elizabeth as Eyes. Eyes. This is the organ of the sense. The organ of the sense, the eye, perceives the sense itself as a father to a son. So in the son or the daughter of the eye is vision. Miranda is not a name that existed in our Latin languages. It was created by Shakespeare. And in Italian, we have different words to say to see. So we have vedere, guardare, osservare, fissare, and of course we have mirare. Now, these are extremely hard to translate into English. Let's just say they're all seeing. It's a different type of seeing. Now, when we use the infinitive of the verb mirare, we get mirando, mirando. But as the O is masculine, you change it to A and it becomes Miranda, which is the only way you can use the verb vision to see in a feminine context as the name of the lady. Of course, Miranda, she is introduced. Its vision is seen. The daughter of the eye, she is introduced in the play as seeing a ship going down in the sea. A ship going down in the sea. It's always, Shakespeare can never get away from seeing an eyes. And so this name actually works. And it's not like the word mirare or mirando is an obscure word. You know, we use it quite often. For example, in Vincenzo Bellini's opera, Adalgisa, the priestess says, mira o norma tuoi genocchi questi cari tui pargoletti, which is see o norma at your knees, your children. Or in Mozart's Don Giovanni, you have Don Elvira exclaiming on our hero, solo mirandolo stretto in catene, alle mie pene calma darò, which is only when I see him in shackles will my pain be soothed. So this is why this man is so intelligent. This guy is not playing around, Stephen. This is a really intelligent man. But of course, the problem with this is that even though I've explained it in detail, you need to be a Latin to understand how all this works.
Well, I think you've done a magnificent job of painting that out. And I use that word on purpose because we can now see the metaphor that you're talking about. And I think that is something that we find in Shakespeare over and over again is he is always using a double image. Always. There are always two stories being told. There are always two images being painted with the words. And that's his brilliance. That's what he's constantly doing, is letting you, he's sharing some insight into his mind, as you say, through that writing all the time. And so it makes total sense to me. The Miranda, even, I know in Spanish to say mira is to look here, see this. But I didn't put together, and I love how you just spelled this out, that the first moment we meet her, what is she doing? She is seeing. And what is she seeing? She's seeing a ship sink into the sea. And it's almost like he's trying to be even funny about it, in pointing out that he has this rivalry with Dudley. He's had this rivalry with Dudley ever since he ascended to becoming Elizabeth's favorite after Dudley was pushed aside. And when we talk about Lord Burleigh, I believe, I'm just getting off on a little bit of a tangent, but I believe it was William Cecil who arranged for the murder of Dudley's wife, because that scandal pushed him away from Elizabeth forever. And that was the end of any speculation that Queen Elizabeth would have anything else to do with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. So I don't think that Burleigh is an innocent. I don't think he's a coward, but that's one of his cowardly ways that I think he dealt with that political issue, was the scandal of murder thrust upon Robert Dudley.
Stephen, I have a very high opinion both of Burleigh and his son, Robert Cecil. It's one thing talking about politics, but real politics, all of these things about right and left, whether it is a monarchy, a democracy, a republic, or a tyranny, it's all meaningless. The only thing that really matters is to manage budgets. And in terms of economic soundness, Burleigh did an extremely fine job. The country was in hyperinflation. The currency, the coins had been debased. Gold and silver coins had been debased. Burleigh wrote a pamphlet on the gold standard, and he even supervised the reminting the coins themselves. This is extraordinary. There's no parallel. I cannot find parallel like this anywhere in the whole of history. I have to go back to the Romans or the Greeks, not so much the Greeks, but to the Romans. This is absolutely phenomenal. If we had a Burleigh nowadays, things definitely would be quite interesting.
We could use one here in the United States right about now, I can tell you, because our inflation is through the roof and the dollar is definitely debased. So we could use a Lord Burleigh here in the U.S.
Oh, but you cannot get a Lord Burleigh in the U.S. I've studied economical theory quite a lot. It's always going down. By the way, since we are talking about inflation, there's always this thing about how much was the 1,000 pounds that Oxford received in 1586.
Mm-hmm.
People like talking, but they never conclude anything. That's what I see a lot in Oxfordianism. So I actually went to the trouble as a mathematician to calculate how much this would be worth. I calculated this back in August 2021. So at that time, 1,000 pounds, I used different indicators, about 20 indicators, both from the US, the UK, and the European Union. And the values range between 383,000 and 8.3 million pounds, giving it an average of 2.444 million pounds. So that's 2,444,000 pounds.
Wow.
That's the equivalent of the 1,000 pounds in August 2021. So we can put also that to rest. Actually, I find it, coming back to Miranda, I find it very interesting that it takes 100 years to do this thing. 100 years. How is it possible that no one ever perceived this? But okay, better late than never. Now, we may proceed to Marina. Again, with Marina from Pericles. I love the play Pericles, by the way. Marina is again the same Italian pun, although now it's not sea of vision, but sea of ocean.
Right.
So marina, we say in our Latin languages, in Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, mar, sea, we say mar, mar. So again, by joining mar and ina, you indicating that this lady is the daughter of the sea. But the pun is it's a sea. He's using just the sea both as S-E-E and S-E-A. Even marina literally means from the sea. Pericles asks Marina, and wherefore called Marina? Marina says, called Marina, for I was born at sea. It's very interesting puns. He can never get away from the sea with Elizabeth de Vere, with this heroine that's always the daughter that has been abandoned by the father.
Well, and you can imagine, I mean, just think for a moment, even in modern context. I mean, I don't like to have these thoughts, but I have to let my brain go to this place in order to have some sort of empathy and relation to what has happened. If someone were to rape my wife and she became pregnant from that rape and then gave birth to this little girl, that's not something you just let go of. That's not something that you forget. That's not something that doesn't haunt you for the rest of your life. It has to haunt you for the rest of your life. And especially when you come to the realization at some point that the little girl is not to blame and there's nothing that she has done that is at fault. And you suddenly feel guilty for your reaction for the first 6 to 7 years of that child's life, allowing that little girl to feel abandoned and feel like she has no father because her actual blood father can't admit and do or provide for her. And now essentially Edward de Vere is her stepfather in a way, or adopted father in a way. And he has chosen not to accept her. I mean, just think about what those first 7 years of life were like for that little girl. And a man with his kind of passion, obviously, came to terms at some point with the guilt he was feeling about how he had treated his wife and this little girl over his own, he made it all about him, right? His own personal grief at her having been raped and having this baby. And so I don't care what time period or era you live in, that is a massive trauma to go through on all levels for everyone involved.
Yes, Stephen, these are indeed very dark corners of the soul. This is a question of personal morality. Of course, I've thought about all this, and I have meditated about this to get into the author's mind. De Vere is definitely not totally innocent on this because he was also going on with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was actually Dudley's domain. So it doesn't naturally excuse what happened to Anne Cecil, which is an extremely tragic figure. But over time, Edward de Vere sees this young lady. Maybe he grew fond of her. Maybe she was actually an extraordinary creature showing remarkable traits of personality and intelligence even in a young age. I know that it's not here or there, but she's also the daughter of a nobleman. She's not the daughter of a commoner. She's the daughter of Dudley. Dudley was reported to have been a handsome man, so probably the lady was also handsome. And I think he definitely ended up liking Liz de Vere quite a lot. And I don't find any of the other daughters in the canon. That's the interesting thing. I only find Elizabeth de Vere. And definitely she grew up to be, from what we know of her, an interesting character. And it's a very complex situation. The wives, the Dudley, the rape, the daughter. It's really something you don't want to be in that place, but these are the challenges that life puts in front of you. And well, Elizabeth de Vere is also Perdita from The Winter's Tale. what you need to know about our culture is that no one in Italy, Spain, or Portugal will call their daughter Perdita. That's ridiculous. It's absurd. Because this word has very negative connotations. It actually has negative sexual connotations. So Shakespeare gives the name Perdita. And by the way, the story of Perdita is exactly the daughter, and Leontes and Hermione. It's a perfect parallel with what happened in real life in De Vere, Cecil, and Liz. Shakespeare uses Perdita for the simple reason that this is an anagram of pirated. And something that is pirated is something that is an illegal reproduction, just as Liz de Vere was, as she was conceived outside wedlock. Even I'm not going to go into deep into Winter's Tale, although fascinating as it is. I just want to say that towards the end of the play, when the statue comes alive, Hermione, she does not address Leontes. She addresses the daughter, and she uses the words, "You gods look down, and from your sacred vials pour your graces upon my daughter's head. Tell me mine own." And what I would like to stress here is that Shakespeare puts Hermione saying, "my daughter," not "our daughter," even though Leontes is in presence.
Mm-hmm.
And he also uses "mine own," not "our own."
Mm-hmm.
You know, these are very open and very clear giveaways, but with Shakespeare, this author is so intelligent that rarely anything is what it seems.
No, that's a wonderful point to make. And I think that it is also, again, it's him very, very stating very clearly what the case is. And you're right. Hermione, comes to life, as it were. She's resurrected in a sense, right? Because we've believed that, or at least Leontes has believed that she's been dead. And he wants to reunite with her. But you're right. She doesn't address him. She speaks about her daughter, and she does call her daughter and claims her as her own. And I think that that's the truth about what happened with Anne Cecil and the birth of Elizabeth de Vere. And we do have that evidence that Anne Cecil, when she learned she was pregnant, consulted with a doctor and was requesting drugs and potions that she believed would induce an abortion, because she knew that the pregnancy was going to be judged the way that it was judged. Now, like you said earlier, we got to be careful about saying what we know and what they knew. And I agree, but she obviously knew the pregnancy would be judged. That doesn't mean that she knew that the pregnancy was Dudley's baby. We can't infer that, but we can infer that she knew that it was going to be looked poorly upon and that it was going to cause her problems. And she tried to eliminate the pregnancy, and it, obviously didn't work. And what happens? We don't get these characters. We don't get Miranda, Marina, and Perdita if Anne Cecil is successful in aborting that baby. And so look at the beautiful plays and characters that develop because of this great trauma, this great tragedy that occurred to this family. It's kind of incredible to think about.
It's a really very moving story. I mean, this is one of those cases where reality actually surpasses fiction, and you cannot help but feel sorry for Anne Cecil. But again, De Vere, he thought he didn't knew he thought or he believed Elizabeth de Vere was Dudley's daughter. She appears definitely Marina, Miranda, Perdita. That's all one can actually be completely sure about. Of course, there's a lot of information on the canon concerning the rape of Anne Cecil, but I don't want to go into that. because it would take us quite a long time. I've deconstructed the entire canon. Last time we did Macbeth. Even the 10% we did of my whole research is enough to ground this as a fact. Perhaps now, Stephen, we could talk about Elizabeth. Elizabeth is also a funny character.
Now, which Elizabeth? One of the interesting things about Edward's life is there were three major Elizabeths in his life. There was the Queen, of course, who I believe was definitely a lover, and I believe that's the Dudley de Vere rivalry. Is that Dudley saw that he was losing his ground and his position with the Queen. The Queen now was bringing Edward to her chamber instead of Robert Dudley. And I believe that Robert Dudley raped Anne Cecil as a revenge tactic. You stole my woman, I'm going to steal yours. That's where the position I come from. But then we also have the daughter, Elizabeth. And then we have his second wife at the end of his life, Elizabeth Trentham. So we need to make sure our listeners know exactly which Elizabeths we're talking about.
Oh, yes. It's Elizabeth the Queen. What you said about Dudley and Elizabeth, this love triangle, it's absolutely, I totally agree with this. I tend to call just Elizabeth the first, Elizabeth Trentham. I just go with the Trentham. There's been a lot of confusion in the last 100 years of Oxfordianism, whatever they call this thing. They call it the De Vere thing, about Elizabeth I. If people had actually gone to a Latin school and learned Greek and Latin, they would know a little bit more how Shakespeare's mind works. Elizabeth I is also one of the five muses. The more one gets to know us, even the less one likes her. He definitely makes appearances in the canon, but not as many suppose, and especially not as Oxfordians mostly think. There's a lot of interpretations that are derivative, fallacious, and mere uneducated guesses with anything to back them up. And even today is Women's Day, so I don't feel like talking much about Elizabeth, so we're just going to get it out of the way, presenting her as another character. Liz first is, of course, the Dark Lady of the Sonnets.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to Mr. Hank Whittemore, he did an excellent work on that. And she is Titania as well. Now, there is one play that people insist, so-called scholars, and I use the term loosely, they insist on seeing this as the Vere sister. Well, but she is not. And that is the Taming of the Shrew. First, to understand Shakespeare, as I've said several times, you need to know our Latin culture and Italian. Now, in the Taming of the Shrew, Katharina, it starts with a K. Please, listeners, listen to this. In Italian, there are no Ks, there are no Ws, there are no Ys, there are not even any Js, and the X's are just used for words that are derived from the Latin. So this is of course, this is a very big flag, very big red flag, because definitely we have Ks in Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish, but they're not Katharina with Ks. They are Katarina, Katerina, and Katarine, all with a C. Now, if Shakespeare, knowing Italian fluently, knows this, why would he choose the K, starting it with K? He is using the K because he wants to use the Greek pun. And because Katharina, it's derived from the Greek word katharos. And katharos means pure. And this is Shakespeare having a stab at the pretense of Liz being a virgin. It's one of those things, methinks the lady does protest too much. Mm-hmm. So Katharina in the Taming of the Shrew is a depiction of Elizabeth I. And there is many parallels that in the author's mind, all Kates, whenever he mentions Kate, he has Elizabeth in mind. I've mentioned the Taming of the Shrew. Now we can talk about The Tempest. There is this amusing song sung by Stefano, which is the master, the swabber, the boatswain and I, the gunner and his mate loved more Megan, Marion, and Marjorie. But none of us cared for Kate, for she had a tongue with a tang, would cry to a sailor, go hang. We love not the savor of tar nor of pitch, yet a tailor might scratch her wherever she did itch. Then to see boys and let her go hang.
This is a scurvy tune.
This is yes, it's just a scurvy tune, like he says afterwards.
Yes,
it's certainly very amusing and bawdy. But let me explain to you why this is a stab at Liz the First. It's because that verse, that tailor might scratch or whatever she did it. Of course, we can take this as a sexual pun, but this is actually a reference to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. For throughout his life, he was in control of Elizabeth, and he was scorned by the nobility for being the son of a tailor. That is really Shakespeare being intelligent. He mixes a historical fact with a sexual pun. It really is really, really good. And also very interesting, to prove exactly that there is a link between Kate and Elizabeth in this author's mind. The cherry on the cake would have to be the Henry IV plays, where Henry Percy Hotspur's wife, she is called Kate, but guess what was her name in real life, Stephen? Can you guess? It's Elizabeth, of course. Elizabeth Mortimer, to be more exact.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a link between Kate and Elizabeth. She's even Kate put down in Measure for Measure, but because she always kept the veer down, but that would take us on a different road. And the reference to
the
having
Taming
a
of the
child
Shrew
is
stuff
also
is very
quite
fascinating. You know, my wife and I are actually that's one of the plays that we're producing this summer for our summer Shakespeare series here in Southern Oregon. And my wife, Annie, and I are going to play Kate and Petruchio in that production. And we just did an episode together about some of the aspects of the relationship between those two characters and how we approached those characters from a theater artist and actor standpoint, and how I approached the play from a director's standpoint. Because, you know, obviously it gets a lot of flack for the way that Petruchio treats Kate in the play. But that's a fascinating angle that I hadn't heard before, that Kate is actually the queen. And when you think about it, based on some of the stories that we know about Elizabeth and the way she treated people, it makes total sense. I mean, she once stabbed one of her ladies in waiting through the hand with a fork because she didn't serve her correctly. And in another instance, she broke the fingers of one of her ladies in waiting in anger because she was upset about something that she had done. Like, she had a temper, and she definitely could be violent and mistreated people quite a lot throughout her history. There's no doubt.
Yes, she definitely mistreated people quite a lot. This is not consistent with the behavior of a virgin. Definitely is not. You also have, she could rail like a docker, and you have a very loose tongue. So definitely this is not compatible with the behavior of a virgin. And definitely an interesting character. Throughout the canon, she starts disappearing more and more. Of course, The Taming of the Shrew is an extremely complex play. It's not the subject of today's episode. I think this is also another problem, which is, in order to understand the dynamics between Petruchio and Catherine, or Katharina. This is paraphrasing the Italian courtship and how we do things in Italy. I understand that for an English or for an American, it's not so easy to understand, and it's not like we like to advertise these things. But Shakespeare, he's 100% correct. This is the courtship. In Italian customs, I mean, I hope I'm not going to get into trouble with my Italian friends. I love you all, lasses from Italy, but this is how they actually behave, Stephen. Women in Italy are in command of the house. They're in command of the house. The husband has no say.
I am very well aware of that. My mother was full-blooded Italian, and I had the quintessential Italian mother, and I came from that type of an Italian family. So I totally understand. My mother ruled the roost. She was in charge in our home. My dad did what she told him to do pretty much all the time, and she ran everything. So I totally understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, so the man is there like a kitten. It doesn't matter. I've worked, Stephen, I'm an old general. I was at one point in command of the equivalent of 2 legions in construction. 2 legions. That's 10,000 people. I've worked with extremely professional people, extremely competent. They were each in charge of 1,000 men. When Italians, they went home. They were in charge of 1,000 men, and they went home like little kittens obeying their wives. That's the way they've always done things. And you know what, Stephen? It works. It works. These Italian women, they know no fear, Stephen. They don't know what the word of fear is. Very passionate ladies. And this Taming of the Shrew is exactly like that. It is basically a woman trying. In the end, Katharina actually has a trucchio on her little finger, and she gets away. And this is how things work. This is the way things work in Italy. Now, in Portugal and Spain, is quite different, but it's more like 50-50. But in Italy, definitely is not. Outside the house, they tend to be more modest and more quiet, but inside the house, they can be quite passionate, and the man is there to take orders.
Well, I think it's very important, the distinction you make with regards to her name, because I never put that together, especially, and it seems so obvious too, because Petruchio has the CH, the Italian CH, which is that K sound, like Chianti, for instance. A lot of people know that word very well, right? Whereas the Kate with the K, you're right, it's not Italian and it's Greek. And he does that obviously for a very specific reason. And like you say, it becomes this play on words. There's also some reference, Petruchio says, why does the world report that Kate doth limp? And he's making a reference. I don't think that Kate actually has a limp. I think what he's saying is that, why does the world conjecture that she is not a virgin? And then he says to her, Kate, like the hazel twig, is straight and slender, as brown in hue as hazelnuts, and sweeter than the kernels. And he's praising her, saying, if you become my partner, this is the way I will talk about you to others. And we will not talk about these other things that people say about you.
Yes, it's like Shakespeare, like everything in Shakespeare, it's very complex. If we open the door to taming, it would lead us to a very different path, because the whole subject is not what people think. Definitely the relationship between De Vere and Elizabeth is there, but there are also other underlying tones, as very much all in Shakespeare.
So where else do you believe that the Queen appears in the canon? What other examples do you have that you think definitely point to Elizabeth I?
No, Stephen, I don't think, it's opening too many doors, but definitely, okay, I think I've mentioned Titania, right?
Yes.
Okay, let me just open this. This is a very difficult door to open, because it would take a lot of time, and just amounts to my giving a conclusion without giving lots of premises for it. But let me just open this single door. She is definitely Lady Macbeth. She is definitely Lady Macbeth. Let me give you like 2 or 3 examples. For example, the opening scene where she says, "You ministers, unsex me here." Now, this, when you say unsex me here, basically is making her a woman without sexual relations. This is what she pretended to be all her life, a virgin. Unsex me here. Then another interesting thing is the last scene where she dies, where she has all these visions. Now, if people actually went to the trouble of studying history and going to the records and doing comparative analysis, they would realize that Lady Macbeth's death is exactly the same as Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, like Lady Macbeth, had visions.
Yes, that's true. That is recorded. I'm aware of that. She was hallucinating in the final days of her life, and we don't know exactly what she saw or what those who were around her heard her claim that she saw. We'll never know. I think they kept that all very much secret. Of course, Robert Cecil claimed that right at the end, she named James her successor. I don't know if that can be true or not, but but it is recorded that she was having hallucinations. She was having visions near the end of her life.
Yes, it is supposed that, like Lady Macbeth, she died of sleep deprivation. There is this anecdote, although it's most likely true, although we have to be careful with these things, that she said to one of the ladies in waiting, "If you knew what I saw," I'm just paraphrasing here, "if you knew what I saw when I closed my eyes, you would never close them." This is exactly the death of Lady Macbeth. Then Lady Macbeth's name, it's never given. Even the expressions he uses is Duncan coming under my battlements, not the Macbeth's battlements, not our battlements, is my battlements. This is very suspicious. And of course, this relation between Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, this is totally the relation between Dudley and Elizabeth the First. That's why Macbeth was the biggest challenge I ever had in terms of deconstruction, but definitely in the way it works. And my deconstruction points clearly in many other aspects that Lady Macbeth is Elizabeth de Vere. Unfortunately, in these cases, my research, I've deconstructed the whole canon. It's many thousands of pages. And, I have to use myself as a reference and go and check what I've written.
Well, what's fun is that's the other play that we're doing this year. We're doing Macbeth and The Taming of the Shrew. Those are our 2 shows this year. So that's a very interesting, and I'm going to have some fun with that during the rehearsal process when I share with the actors some of the motivations of the characters and what's going on in the scenes. But I agree with you, and I believe that Duncan is a derivative of Mary, Queen of Scots. And I think that's one of the reasons why the play is set in Scotland. And I think that Elizabeth, all of her life, felt guilty about her cousin's death. And I think she was pushed into it. And I think she regretted it for the rest of her life. And I think it haunted her. It haunted her the way that Richard III is haunted by all of those that he has murdered near the end of that play as well. And I think that's what was going on with Elizabeth. She was responsible for the death of an anointed queen, and it never sat well with her, and she never got over that guilt. That's what I think.
Yes, Mary Queen of Scots is a very interesting character as well. But you note even my deconstruction of Macbeth points Duncan as Anne Cecil, not Mary Queen of Scots. You probably have to go back to our
I remember, and the metaphor, the rape metaphor there, right? If Dudley is Macbeth, and then
yes.
the way, I remember that. And I think again, when we talk about Shakespeare, we talk about there are always so many different layers that are on every aspect, and I think that the parallels can overlap, and we have a double image there without a doubt.
Yes, and we only did 10% of my deconstruction on that work. So the sexual puns come one after another throughout the play. But now we've talked about this Herod and Elizabeth I. Perhaps we could move on to the actual love affairs of Shakespeare, of De Vere. And for that, even I have chosen Measure for Measure, which is actually one of my favorite plays of Shakespeare. I would say everyone loves their Hamlet. I love my Hamlet, and Measure for Measure. For me, Measure for Measure is the greatest achievement of De Vere. I find this play absolutely fascinating. I loved it from the first time I read it. I think it's a very intelligent work. I think it's the most autobiographical of all works, even more so than Hamlet. And this is a play not only about De Vere, but also the lasses. So I would like to start with Anne Cecil, the poor Anne Cecil. She definitely appears in Measure for Measure. She is what I call in Shakespeare the second heroine, which is the mother of the first, which is Elizabeth De Vere, and she is the neglected wife of the Earl. It's truly a subject of tragedy. It's impossible not to feel sorry for Anne Cecil. It's perhaps the most tragic love story I have ever come across. I look upon Anne Cecil as a merge of two characters, which is Puccini's Madama Butterfly and a character of one of my favorite authors, which is the Russian Pushkin from his novel in verse, Evgeny Onegin, a depiction of Tatiana, the beautiful Tatiana. So Anne Cecil stands in between Madama Butterfly and this Tatiana.
Okay.
And the interesting, really, it's remarkable. Actually, I couldn't recommend any better book to read than Evgeny Onegin. Beautiful work, one of the most beautiful works I've ever read. It really stands up there. Incredible, influential in all the culture of Russia. Extraordinary. So, how is Anne Cecil appearing in Measure for Measure? Well, she appears as Mariana. But let me just give you the background. So, De Vere was made a ward of state when he was 12 and joined Burghley House, where Anne Cecil, age 6, was also living. You have to imagine a puritanical household where all is gray, dull, and unexciting, and suddenly a fashionable young man arrives on the scene, someone that delights in music, dancing, poetry, exercise, and is endowed with fiery eloquence. And besides that, he's also an earl. I mean, Stephen, we are men, and we know how impressionable young ladies can be. Even if De Vere never made a pass on, of course, at that age, he would never do it, but the lady never would have a chance. Resistance would be futile. So definitely she would have seen in him a very interesting character and may have been in love with him from a certain age. Eventually, De Vere and Anne Cecil got married in 1571. Whatever the politician Burghley may have written on the matter has to be taken as the words of politician, which is worthless. So he may have said that the Earl had gotten asked the daughter in marriage. Of course, he can say whatever he wants. Of course, this was not the case. We would like to imagine the author as this free, independent hero, but this is not true. Burghley was in control of England. What many people forget is that during that time, Portugal was the main dominant power in the world. And we called England Cecilia, the land of Cecil. Okay, never mind Elizabeth. It was the land of Cecil. So there he did what was he instructed to do, which was to marry Anne Cecil. We know that there was not keen on his new bride. One could say, she did not ring his bell. And the fact is that the marriage remained unconsummated until after 1582. That's 10 years. So how can you put this? He never gave a jolly good sing to Anne Cecil, and he could not. He could have said, I would if I could, but I cannot, or I'm sorry, love, but this ain't gonna fly. So this is partly a shotgun wedding. So he was forced to marry the lady.
Do you think that he saw
Anne
her?
Cecil of,
Do you think that? Excuse me. Do you think that he saw her as sort of a younger sister? That he had a view of her that was not the way he saw other women, and that he felt like it would be awkward, kind of weird. I think it would be weird growing up with this little girl who, as you mentioned, is 6 years his junior, and seeing her when he first meets her. He's 12 and he's starting to feel his hormones. She's 6. She's just a little girl. And through those years being raised together, I could see where you would develop this very, sibling-like relationship. And then it would be very strange to now have to determine that is going to be a object of sexual desire. And I think it's important to note the women that he does end up with. I mean, obviously the queen, but then, when he does have his affair with Anne Vavasour, she's, this stunning beauty and has this, allure to her. And I almost wonder if he didn't suffer from sort of a Madonna whore complex to some degree. And he saw Anne Cecil as this, sort of Madonna character, but what he was really drawn to was more of the whore type of character, like the Catherine type of character.
Stephen, sexuality is a very broad field, and it's a spectrum. Now, I don't think that they being raised together, this would have been an impediment to have a happy marriage. Of course, there's been cases where this has happened, and the couple was very happy. But first, we need to look at the ages. De Vere was 21 when he got married. If you believe he was married in 1550, which I don't. I believe he was either born in 1548 or 1549. Let's just take the 1550. De Vere was 21. Anne Cecil was 15. Stephen, as men, when we are 20, 21, we have no interest whatsoever in girls of 15. If anything, we look for an older sexual partner.
Right. Yeah. Well, I remember, you're looking for women in their 30s because you've been told that they're the best and that they know what to teach you and that they've just come into their sexual prowess. And, oh, yeah, I remember my young 20s very well. And, yeah, I was aiming up, definitely not down.
So you see that's why we need to look at things, bring realism and naturalism to this question and not think, as some people have done in the last 100 years, what should have been or what could have been. This is how human nature is. Then the fact that their marriage remained unconsummated leads me to the assumption that she probably was not attractive to De Vere. Now, this is also very subjective whether someone is attractive or not, but because the marriage remained unconsummated for 10 years, I think that's pretty obvious. Of course, De Vere would not be keen on this association because he would think that Anne Cecil was actually a spy in the bedroom for her father. Eventually, he grew to learn that she wasn't. So that's why this story is so tragic. But yes, definitely, Ancestral is the champion in number of appearances as heroine. She got married like Madama Butterfly of Puccini when she was 15. Unlike Madama Butterfly, she was completely crushed as a woman, as a wife, as a mother, as a lover, everything. In 1588, Ancestral dies age 31. My research into different plays has led me to the conclusion that it was most likely suicide. De Vere ends up carrying the burden of guilt till the end of his days. And in the canon, she makes this fantastic number of appearances. She is Helena, Hermione, Hero, Thaisa, Desdemona, Ophelia, Duncan, Imogen, and of course, Mariana of Measure for Measure. De Vere is very poignant about making a profession of faith, of singing the praises of Ancestral in Much Ado About Nothing through the epitaph that Claudio reads on the monument of Hero, which is done to death by slanderous tongues, was the hero that here lies.
Mm-hmm.
Death in guerdon of her wrongs gives a fame which never dies. So the life that died with shame lives in death with glorious fame. Of course, when the author wrote this, the wife was already dead. And this is, in the author's mind, the memory of Ancestral rising from the ashes as a phoenix. Of course, there is the art of poetry, or poetics, which means that the author has to embellish the real life story due to poetical necessity. For, of course, as an author, you need the audience or the readers to fall in love with your heroine. Now, you cannot do this through the rape element. First, because rape is not the subject of comedy. And you cannot endear a raped heroine to the audience, because a raped woman would be the object of sorrow, not love. So there's this always this present notion. He's very specific about what he means, but he has to embellish the truth. Now, as Mariana is definitely ancestral. Of course, the name Mariana, of course, Anna is Anne. That's simple. Mari is a pun on married. But above all, Mariana is a name of Latin origin, which means star of the sea. Of course, with the V, anything connected with ancestral, the sea, the vision, the eyes is always there. He is presented in the play as the intended of Angelo, whom he courted, but then abandoned, pretending to find in her discoveries of the zona. As Angelo says, for that her reputation was disvalued in levity. That's exactly what De Vere did when he discovered that Ancestral was first pregnant. And the Duke in Measure for Measure, when he is first mentioning Mariana to Isabel, he says, "Have you not heard speak of Mariana, the sister of Frederick, the great soldier who miscarried at sea?" Again, you have the sea. This man is upset. He's good, Stephen. He was really, really good. Mariana, he always has to have his fun with the sea, and the miscarried, of course, is a term that can be definitely is associated not only with the sea, but also with pregnancy. And yes, this dejected Mariana still keeps her affection for Angelo, just like Ancestral kept her affection for De Vere. We know from the play, Angelo says that he was estranged from Mariana for 5 years. That's exactly what happened to De Vere as well. Between De Vere and Ancestral, he was estranged for 5 years and a few months. And of course, Mariana is described as waiting for Angelo at the moated grange, the famous moated grange. Whereas Duke says that at the moated grange resides this dejected Mariana. Now, this is actually pretty interesting. A grange is a large manor house, and Anne Cecil waited for De Vere to return back to her at Theobald's. Theobald's is a building that no longer exists, but I did a little bit of research on it. And in a book entitled The Environs of London, Volume 4, Counties of Herts, Essex, and Kent, Theobald's is described as the original manor house was surrounded by a moat. So this means that Anne Cecil, just like Mariana, waited for De Vere at a moated grange. And really, Stephen, you cannot make this stuff up. Then we have Angelo. Angelo, of course, is also a depiction of De Vere. It's a very interesting character. There's many parallels between him and Oxford. De Vere, he never does anything randomly. When the Duke first introduces Angelo, of course, means angel, but De Vere has a special type of angel in mind. When the Duke first introduces Angelo, he says, "Heaven doth with us as we would torches do, not light them for themselves." And Angelo, though beginning his career in office as just an honorable, he starts driving into the abyss. Then he says, "Let's write good angel on the devil's horn. It is not the devil's crest." And we need to understand why Shakespeare is so keen on putting Angelo alongside torches, light, and the devil. This is simply because Angelo is supposed to represent Lucifer, the bright angel that fell from grace. Even Angelo, in the middle of the play, says, "Alack, when once our grace we have forgot, nothing goes right. We would and we would not." And this is again De Vere punning on the name of Anne, because Anne is etymologically derived from grace. So Angelo here is definitely saying, our grace we have forgot, he has forgotten Anne. So these are just a few parallels, but more than enough to make the case of Mariana as Anne Cecil. There are a lot more. Very interesting, very intelligent work, the way De Vere did this.
And it's very beautiful, too, when you think about the amount of guilt that he feels for the way that he treated her and the history they had together, and the way that in the end he misses her. He wants her back. And it's a very sad story when you think about the tragedy of it all. And like you say, you can't write this stuff. He did write it because he was writing it right out of his soul, right from the depths of his own heart and his own emotions and feelings. And I think he too had trouble sleeping because of the guilt that he carried with him through his life over some of the decisions that he made. And it's very clear that by the time he ends up with Elizabeth Trentham, that he has matured to such a degree in his choice of partners and in what he understands a husband to be by that point in his life. And I think that's an interesting character arc for him, from, playboy extraordinaire, favorite of the queen, sharing her bedchamber, to unwilling husband who looks down upon his commoner wife, even though the queen raises Burleigh up to make him no longer a commoner, but everyone knew. And then to feel the amount of pain and anger that he felt about what had happened, to then coming to terms with accepting her and her becoming a partner in his life. And they do have 2 more children together. I think there's one in there too that they lose, if I recall.
Yes.
But they do have two more daughters that survive. And then, the whole dalliance with Anne Vavasauer, who I know we're going to get into next. And, obviously that child he has with her out of wedlock. So I think it's, the story of the women in his life is also the story of his life. And I think it is so heart-wrenching when you look at the number of horrible things that happened and the way he depicts them through the poetry and the plays.
Yes, it's indeed a very moving story. The story of Van Cecil. And he definitely carried the blame throughout his life. But this is all a gradually learning process. We cannot expect young people to have the maturity of older gentlemen. Just that as we should not have older gentlemen behaving like children. It's definitely sad. This the last scene of Measure for Measure, it's really a masterwork. The character of Mariana is absolutely remarkable. I love the introduction when she's introduced at the Grange with a beautiful song, oh take those lips away, that so sweetly were for Swan. And she talks about music, and in the end, in the last scene, Mariana has this very poignant phrase when she asks Isabella to kneel down. She says, they say most men are molded out of faults, and so may mine be, and men become much better just by being a little bad. Well, the author definitely was making a self-accusation, and basically this is Anne Cecil rising up as a phoenix. Well, it's one of we wouldn't have the canon as it is without Anne Cecil. It's actually interesting. Every poet seems to have muses, but apparently we cannot find the muses of Shakespeare, but we have the muses of De Vere. So just to touch this on the muses, Ovid had Corinna, Propertius had his Cynthia, Bibulus had Belia, Catullus had Lesbia, Horace had Pyrrha, Dante had Beatrice, Petrarch had Laura, Tasso had Lucretia, even Goethe, German, and as a German, certainly boring and with no sense of humor. He also had quite a few muses. The great Pushkin had Natalia Goncharova, Byron had Caroline, and then suddenly very interesting happens. We cannot find the ones of Shakespeare. I wonder if we follow the orthodox pseudo scholarship, that is, we cannot find the muses. I wonder why that is. But once you change the paradigm, you start seeing exactly that there were real life patterns, and gosh, were they interesting. Now we could move on, Stephen, to the firebrand.
The one thing before we move forward, the one thing I would like to talk about with regards to Measure for Measure is I believe that Measure for Measure is also an indictment of Elizabeth's court in a lot of ways. I think when you look at some of the subplots and you have characters like Lucio and Pompey and Mistress Overdone, I think is the character in the play. And you have these debaucherous, whoremongering and prostitute characters that are running around in the subplot of the play. And then you have the story of Isabella's brother, another Claudio, who's in prison. And the reason he's in the tower is because he had sex with a woman out of wedlock. He was with the wrong lady in waiting, which is also another parallel for Edward de Vere and Anne Vavasour being thrown in the tower. And I think that there's a subtext here throughout the play that sort of pokes Queen Elizabeth herself right in the eye. And that is to say that, I'm being punished for something that everyone is doing. You're doing it. He's doing it. She's doing it. Everyone's doing it. I just happened to get caught, and you got pissed off because you're jealous that I went with this woman and wasn't with you. And I think that that's a huge part of Measure for Measure. Is it's saying to Elizabeth, you're a fraud. You're a hypocrite because you're having sex with all these courtiers. And it's okay for you, but I go have sex with this lady in waiting and by mistake get her pregnant. And suddenly I'm in the tower confined and possibly about to lose my head. And then he doesn't. The punishment is she ostracizes him from court. She banishes him from court. Right. And I think that there's a big part of that in Measure for Measure.
Yeah, you certainly have a point there. Definitely. There's also a stab at Elizabeth in Measure for Measure, both in the character of Lucio and Kate deep down. You just have to pay really good attention to this subplot, but it's really complex. Definitely what you say is correct. But by the time Measure for Measure was written, I put date down as 1591. I look upon it as a marriage piece between Brentham and de Vere. It's very difficult to date the plays, but I see this as a marriage piece because in opera, this would fall totally as a marriage piece. And by that time, 1591, de Vere was well over Elizabeth. She had receded into the back and had become less even than a secondary character. When de Vere was released from prison in 1581, he also abandoned court. I don't think he was even more interested. He expresses this constantly throughout the canon, that, okay, he was a young man. He had ambitions. These ambitions were not fulfilled, thankfully for future generations that enjoyed the Shakespeare work. And it was an eye-opener, his time in prison. And definitely, I don't think he was that keen when he saw all his hopes dashed, his public embarrassment. He was not longer keen on playing the statesman. It's very interesting. I've written quite a lot about it in my deconstruction of Measure for Measure. This gradual process of enlightenment, especially when genius is concerned, it always happens at this age of 30. And of course, who taught a lot to de Vere was the muse number 3, Firebrand, and I call her Anne Vavasour. I don't usually say Vavasour.
Sure.
I'm not even sure how it's pronounced.
Neither do I. I've heard it multiple ways. I've heard Vavassor. I've heard Vavasour. I've heard Vavasour. Vavasour is probably more accurate because it sounds almost French to me. I don't know her
French.
lineage.
For me, this is French. I will say Vavasour. So muse number 3 is the Firebrand, Femme Fatale, the Irresistible, and Vavasour. 10 years younger than de Vere. He probably met her in 1579 or 1580. They had a child in 1581, and they were both committed to the Tower of London. Anne Vavasour was the maid of honor of Elizabeth, and therefore could not engage in any sexual relation or liaison without the permission of the Queen. Finally, when the relation with de Vere and the pregnancy was discovered, they were both sent to the Tower, and Vavasour did to de Vere what de Vere had done to Anne Cecil. So talk about poetic justice. Just as de Vere completely crushed Anne Cecil, and Vavasour completely crushed the Veer. So, yes, actions have consequences.
And I believe
and
she gives birth to the baby in the tower, right? Like Elizabeth throws them in the tower, and I think she has
yes,
she delivers the child while locked up in prison. No?
it's true. Indeed, had the child in the tower. I think that Anne Vavasour is very important for the understanding of Shakespeare. I don't think that the canon would be as it is without Anne Vavasour. These kind of affairs uh, between such a man and such a woman, they almost always end tragically. They are always like a bittersweet experience for every man. Rarely or almost never does Jack get Jill. Still, there's a very positive thing to gain from these relations, which is the mental and the emotional maturity they bring along with it. So, in the man's mind, these kind of sexual, they're more than sexual relations, but these relations, these liaisons can always be described as the one that got away in the man's mind. And I sincerely wish that every man may have had his Vavasour in his late 20s or early 30s, because it definitely is however bitter and hard the emotional suffering may be at the time. Definitely, there's a lot to be learned from that kind of relation. Uh, Theo fell madly in love with the beautiful, witty, passionate, and Vavasour when she was 19, 20 years old. She appears very often in the canon, and initially she appears as the heroine, but gradually she also starts taking secondary roles until she completely disappears. And this is when Shakespeare is finally over the crush he had on her. Of course, both in real life, it takes years to get over this, but he eventually did. And basically, she had completely control over the Veer. She turned the earl round her little finger. And yes, in the canon, Anne Vavasour is Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. She is Rosalind. She is Rosaline. She is Beatrice of Much Ado About Nothing. And she is even Diana in All's Well that ends well. That has a little bit of this Diana has a little bit of a Greek fun. Uh, the D being the Theo of Greek, which is number two. And she also appears, number two is meaning the second Anne, the first Anne being Anne Cecil, this is Anne Vavasour, among others. But here, in measure, of course, she is Juliet. The part is small, which indicates that when the play was written, the author was gradually getting over Vavasour, but though the part is small, it's still quite poignant and full of real life parallels. Uh, for example, in the play, when Isabel is discussing Juliet with Lucio, he tells him that they are cousins, but only through friendship. As Isabel says, adoptedly, our schoolmates changed their names by vain though apt affection. Now, both Vavasour and Trentham were almost the same age, and they were both maids of honor of Queen Elizabeth. And at the same time, and without doubt, they knew one another. And that's why this close proximity leads Isabel to call Juliet Vavasour cousin. Then another interesting parallel is Vavasour was sent to prison with child, and so did Juliet. Juliet is in care of the state, and so was Vavasour whilst in prison. Juliet is delivered in prison, and so was Vavasour. Both the father of the child, Claudio, together with the mother, Juliet, are both sent to prison, not just one of them. And this is exactly what happened to De Vere and Vavasour. When Juliet is delivered of the child, both her and Claudio are released from prison, just like it happened to Vavasour and De Vere. And Claudio, when he is introduced in the play, he is being dragged publicly through the streets to prison. And this is exactly what happened to De Vere, because when De Vere found out that he was going to be arrested for impregnating the Vavasour, he attempted to flee London. And of course, we come to the final pun, which I find very interesting, which is this name Claudio. Now, this name Claudio is derived, his etymological derivation is lame. And that is exactly what became to De Vere following the Vavasour-Juliet affair. For after a duel with the lass's uncle, Thomas Nivet, De Vere was wounded and lamed for the rest of his life, thereby becoming a real life Claudio. So these parallels are absolutely fascinating. There's no way this can all be a coincidence.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And especially when you talk about that aspect of it. And we see that aspect in the sonnets too, where the poet refers to himself as lame and refers to that injury that he receives from Anne Vavasour's uncle, I think it is Thomas Nivet. And they are brawling in the streets, and it's a family versus family war, just like the Montagues and Capulets in Romeo and Juliet. And there are three separate brawls, just like the Prince Aeschylus in Romeo and Juliet talks about, is you 3 times have you disturbed the peace of my streets, no more, there will be no more of this. And the Queen had to do the same thing with regards to these 2 families. But he does get wounded, and we don't know to the extent of what that injury is, but I do know that in rapier and dagger style fencing, you are commonly aiming for your opponent's thighs. What you want is to sever an artery. You're not actually trying to stab them through the heart or through the chest or through the eye. You're actually looking to slash open their thigh so they'll bleed to death. And obviously Thomas Nivet was aiming for De Vere's leg and got him pretty good, apparently. It almost caused his death, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life after that. We don't know anymore to the extent of what the injury is. Some speculate that it may have even rendered him unable to father more children. If you would think about it, if Thomas Nivet is going after De Vere for having had an affair with his niece and disturbing her honor in such a way as he did, that, it's not uncommon that the champion family member is going to go after the offending party's private parts. He may have been aiming directly for De Vere's family jewels on purpose. You know what I mean?
Stephen, that would be connected to the style of fencing. Indeed, targeting the legs makes sense, and targeting the arteries. As for targeting the family jewels, that would be unlikely. That would be unlikely because during sword fighting, they tend to be quite quick, not like in the movies where people are fighting for half an hour.
Right.
They tend to last just a few seconds. Then it depends on the type of sword. If it is a rapier, you would definitely target the legs, or you would target the torso. Depends on what kind of injury you want to inflict. But if you look at De Vere's life history, I would say that if he had become somehow emasculated, it's very hard to think that he would marry Elizabeth Trentham. But of course, this is all speculation. What we definitely know is that the author, indeed, in the sonnets, refers to himself as being lame. And there's Claudio again, as I just said. He is also lame from the Vavasour affair. So definitely, the veil was Claudius. Um, but he being married again, I would probably say there's nothing to hint at his emasculation. It definitely is more something to do with the leg, because uh, hitting that area with the sword wouldn't make much sense. The thrust is, that's not the way you thrust a sword. That's actually very ungentlemanly. Even if it was quite an offense that they might have done to Vavasour in Nivet's opinion, that's not how people fought in England. If it was Italy or Spain or Portugal, yes, we do it. We had that type of fencing, but in England, it was extremely uncommon.
Oh, you wild Latins, you get so passionate about things.
Yes, it's a good thing to be passionate. I don't think anyone that's not passionate is reading Shakespeare, and he definitely was a very passionate man, and he was quite fond of the ladies,
And I
and
think
especially this.
I absolutely agree with you that of all the ladies in his life and of the female characters in the canon, that Elizabeth Trentham is definitely the model for Isabella in Measure for Measure. By all accounts, she was a very highly respected and highly regarded lady. She had a certain amount of her own accumulated wealth, and she was obviously really good at managing books because she helped secure and stabilize De Vere's finances after they get married. She builds up a pretty sizable amount of wealth. In her will, when she dies, she leaves £500 for a monument, for a funeral and a monument to be built. We don't know what happened to that. We don't know where that money went or why we don't find a monument of such anywhere that has been discovered. But as you pointed out earlier, if £1,000 was 2.4 million in today's money, or in August 2021's money, then we can, do that math pretty easily. £500 would have been $1.2 million to leave for a monument,
Yes.
and that we don't see or don't have or have not discovered, which is very interesting.
We cannot even be sure when exactly De Vere died. And 1604, that date seems really suspicious.
I
Really,
just
really
did a
suspicious.
2-part special series on that that is available in our bonus feature library about Edward de Vere's death and the mystery surrounding that. But without delving into that, let's talk about Elizabeth Trentham and where else she appears in the canon.
Yes, Elizabeth Trentham. She is the formidable lady. So after much suffering and successive amorous disappointments against all odds, De Vere meets this remarkable lady, Elizabeth Trentham, who became his wife in late 1591. We do not know for certain the year of her birth, but was anywhere between 1559 and 1562, meaning she was about the same age as Vavasour. Like Vavasour, she was a maid of honor of the queen. She was a maid of honor for 10 years. Whereas the core of Vavasour was levity, Trentham was all seriousness. He is described by the records as a court beauty. Her life records, what survived, it's actually quite impressive. She managed her husband's patrimony, handling all his secular affairs, repaying all his debts, and she even rebought Hedingham Castle that the wayward De Vere had sold. This so that her son, or their son, would have the ancestral home of Oxford. All this clearly demonstrates that this was indeed a remarkable, formidable, and gifted lady. A prodigy of nature, for sure. And thankfully, these women do really exist and they can be met with. The wooing of this lady must have been quite hard for De Vere. She definitely knew about all the scandals involving this man. And in Measure for Measure, though Isabel, she's well acquainted with the facts of life, because Trentham is definitely Isabel in Measure for Measure, without doubt, as I will proceed to prove through just a few arguments. Although she was acquainted with the facts of life, she never indulges in love throughout the entire play until the end. And this is left to interpretation. That's why, following the opera tradition, this is a wedding piece. This falls in the category of the wedding piece. It always has struck me quite odd that such a formidable lass would take De Vere as husband. So definitely there was something about this man that made him different from all other men. So I think we know what that was, because when you have a poet with fiery eloquence, resistance is pretty much futile. Elizabeth Trentham is, as I said, Isabella or Isabel. She's more often referred to as Isabel in the play. She is introduced as a young nun, which, considering the chastity vow that was imposed upon the maids of honor of the queen, that was exactly what Trentham was for every man, a young nun. That's pretty obvious. The convent's name is actually also very interesting, which is called Saint Clare. Saint Clare was indeed a real life saint, living about 1200s. He was one of the first followers of Saint Francis. And Saint Clare means bright. And this is one of the epithets of Elizabeth I, because she was always described as ever bright and beautiful. So she's actually a nun of the ever bright and beautiful. So this is just De Vere punning on the maid of honor. Isabella, like Trentham, is described as being beautiful. As the Duke says, the hand that has made you fair has made you good. She is described by her brother Claudio as possessing gifted eloquence. So did Trentham. Claudio says, in her youth, there is a prone and speechless dialect such as move men. Besides, she has prosperous thought when she will play with reason and discourse, and well she can persuade. Now, from her life records, this is Trentham to a T. For all the secular business that she conducted in her husband's behalf requires a high level of reason and eloquence, which she clearly possessed, just like in the play. Further, there's a few extra bits of information that are so small that they are quite poignant. Like Isabella, Trentham's father had just recently died. So her father was Thomas Trentham. He had died in 1587. And just as Isabella, Trentham had an older brother. And her elder brother's name was Francis Trentham, who in the play, surprise, surprise, is presented as the sister Francisca. So Shakespeare made the brother Francis into Francisca, the sister. And also, Trentham in the play is a noblewoman. Isabel in the play, just like Trentham, is a noblewoman, not a commoner. For as Aeschylus says, alas, this gentleman that I would save the most noble father. And finally, and this is really the cherry on the cake, this is really intelligent from De Vere, is this pun he uses. Now, because this is the last one, definitely has to be derived from our Latin languages. It's this name, Isabel. Okay, in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, we also have the name Elizabeth. So in Italian, the Italian go with their usual gracefulness, which is Elisabetta, which sounds pretty good. Elisabetta. In Spanish and Portuguese, it doesn't sound so good because our languages are more strict. So we say Elizabeth. But there's a problem in this, is that in our languages, Elisabetta and Elizabeth of Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish, these names are derived from Elizabeth of England. Now, Elizabeth in English is derived from Elisheva. Elisheva. And Stephen, do you want to guess how we say in Portuguese and Spanish Elisheva? Care to guess?
Would it
That's
possibly be
Isabel? Isabel.
Isabel.
So, yes. So, Elizabeth's Isabel. And to make that fact, establish that as a fact, Elizabeth I of England, we call her Isabel I. And Elizabeth II, even today, we call her Isabel. So, and there's definitely a pattern in this. It's pretty obvious. This is just the Vish showing off his erudition in terms of Latin languages. And of course, De Vere would naturally know that Elizabeth was being called Isabel by the Spanish and the Portuguese because of all the argy-bargy that was going on between Spain and England. And Portugal and then Spain was the dominant power of De Vere's day. So naturally, a knowledge of Latin languages would certainly be there. In De Vere's case, I doubt the Spanish or the Portuguese you will understand Spanish if you speak Italian, but you will not understand Portuguese because Portuguese is really complex. And basically, you cannot make this stuff up concerning Trentemore or any of the other female characters. The Duke is also an autobiographical representation of the author. It is, in my opinion, it's the most autobiographical. The fantastical Duke of Dark Corners is the most autobiographical character of Shakespeare, and it is basically a Hamlet in his 40s. This play was had as an inspiration Cinthio, and the novel of Cinthio, Epitia. And it's actually very interesting because the novel of Cinthio is very different. And though it was derived, especially because of the Vienna aspect, that's the main reason. And there's all this sexual relations in the novel. But if you pay attention to the novel of Cinthio, the changes that Shakespeare did to this novel is just to describe his own life affairs. For example, Cinthio has an emperor of Vienna. Shakespeare puts a duke because he is a duke, he is an earl. In the end, Euriste, who in Cinthio, who is designed to represent Angelo, he actually kills the brother of Epitia, who represents Isabella. In Shakespeare, he does not, because De Vere survived prison. there's like 12 different aspects between Cynthia and Shakespeare. Shakespeare adapted them to suit De Vere's life, because this is his own life history, not the life of the famous grain man from Stratford. Finally, when you put all this into perspective, Stephen, and you ask a mathematician what are the odds of this play, and by extension the entire canon, to have been written by any other man rather than De Vere, well, mathematically, with just what we spoke, because there's actually a lot more, but just with this, the odds are 0%. Not 1%, not 0.1%, is 0%. It could not have been written by any other man than De Vere. There is no poet, nor any man in the entire history of the world that has ever or will ever go to such lengths to celebrate another man's ladies. That would be absurd. And it's on this day, the Woman's Day, that thanks to the ladies, in this case, through Measure for Measure, that we are absolutely certain that Shakespeare was Edward V.
I absolutely agree with you, Luís. And it's been a fascinating journey through not only the lives of these ladies, but the way that they have touched his life and the way that he memorialized it through writing about them. And it's agreed. And I scratch my head sometimes at how people can just bury their heads in the sand or dig in their feet and argue that the writer was anyone else, or could have possibly been anyone else. Because when you look at these autobiographical parallels, they don't exist in any other life. And there is no reason whatsoever that any other writer would take this man's life and put it to paper like this in so many ways. And oftentimes, as we've pointed out in this episode, basically saying the same thing over and over again, just with a different character and in a different storyline. And I think, that's something that we see in the sonnets. He says, why write I all one ever the same? Why do I do nothing but dress old words new? And that's not only true in the sonnets, but it's also true in the plays. He's just constantly telling similar stories about the same four ladies, maybe five if you include the queen as well. These same five women keep popping up over and over and over and over again, and the impact they had on him is obvious and profound.
Yes, Stephen, that's absolutely correct. I don't think we should trouble ourselves much with what other people think. They call Oxfordians heretics. I think they're mispronouncing it. I think they meant erudite. I think that these kind of people should do a little bit more study, because they're not actual scholars. I think their level of scholarship goes along the way of, I think I would not be surprised if they were to think, okay, the Grain Man wrote Shakespeare, then they could follow up this with saying that, for example, Washington invented washing machines, William Penn invented pens, and Benjamin Franklin invented, let's say, frankness. That's the kind
Benjamin
of
Franklin. Oh yeah, he's the guy who was the king of candid, right? That's why they called him so frank. He was so frank all the time.
Yes, he invented frankness. Before then, people were not frank. So, Stephen, there's a lot of people that have very strange ideas. We exist within our own skin. I think people trouble themselves too much with what other people think. These people are not scholars. These people are not impartial. They're not scholarly. They're just okay, I don't want to be disrespectful, but they don't know anything about the Latin world, so they cannot have any valid opinion. These, I tend to think, whenever I think about them, I think that the abbots nobody from the order of Latter-day morons, and medically speaking, I think they are totally mentally bonkers, completely doolally. And
well, it's
I
true,
feel,
Luís, and one of the reasons why I was so happy to have you come back and do this episode, and I believe that's one of the reasons why our original episode together is so popular among our listeners, is because of this perspective that you bring that is so different from so many others who, as you say, are not versed in Latin culture. They're not versed in the Latin languages. They're just not capable of looking at the words and the wordplay and the puns and the structural element of the mind that had to be involved when De Vere was putting his pen to paper and creating all of these things that you so richly bring out for us through your perspective. And I'm certainly appreciative of you providing this time for us to take apart these plays and to point out to us so specifically where these women became the five muses of De Vere's life and what beauty they brought to all of us now 400 years later who can enjoy these works. And through this perspective, I think, feel the depth of them even more than we ever have before.
yes, definitely, Stephen. Poets are always very passionate, just like composers. Uh, Not only poets, composers are totally obsessed with their muses. God Mozart was obsessed with his wife, but also with her sisters, the Weberins. They were all sopranos. Constanze, Aloysia, Josefa. Puccini had his Elvira. Verdi had his Giuseppina. Wagner had his Cosima. Chopin had his George Sand. You can find them in the compositions. You can find them in the composers' lives. You can find even the love affairs of the poets in every single one of the poets I mentioned. But whenever it comes to Shakespeare, it's always a blank, a blank. So uh, I have very little respect for these so-called scholars. They have no part of my life. They play no part of my life. I think these people are so low that they could crawl under a rug with the top hat on. And the books they write, these people obsessed with the grain man, they should, just as we put counter indications on medication, they should put counter indications on these books they write, like saying that the contents are revolting and will induce queasiness, and in most cases have been found to associate madness because they don't make any sense. And fortunately now, and as the years progress, we start one, and we continue to understand the author better, because this is really what is important, is to understand what the plays are about. Because even if you were to receive an email now saying that these pseudo scholars from Oxbridge and from Yale, Princeton, and Harvard, they have finally caved to the evidence and accepted uh, De Vere as the actual author. I mean, I know that he was the author. You know that he was the author. So there would be no really reason to celebrate, because we already know this. It will have no impact on me. Because knowing that he is the author is one thing, but to know what the plays are about is a much more complex issue. And that was what I really wanted to find out. It's been a very interesting journey. I thank you for the opportunity of having me again here on this show, and I hope the listeners now understand the workings of De Vere's mind a little better. And before we finish, Stephen, I would just like to add a little something that I am sure will be welcomed by the listeners.
Okay.
Now,
Sure, go ahead.
As Buddhists, Stephen, we try to mitigate suffering when we can. And I know that this authorship issue is prone to make people nervous and anxious. For many around there think that the pseudonym William Shakespeare will never be decoded. So concerning this, I would just like to tell everyone that they can put their anxieties and worries aside. For by music and through music, I have indeed successfully deciphered and deconstructed the name William Shakespeare. And I did it back in late 2021. I have not come public with it. I have to do a lot of meditation on the consequences of this, but rest assured, it has been done. And again, thank you for the opportunities.
Well, I think what you just did there, Luís, is what we call teasing the audience. And I think you did the setup for what is going to now have to be another episode in the future where you explain yourself, sir, when it comes to deconstructing the pseudonym William Shakespeare. But we will definitely save that topic for another day because we have exhausted our time here in this episode for certain.
Well, challenge accepted, Stephen. Just listen to music. Just focus on music, and God Mozart will tell you all.
Very good. Thank you so much, Luís. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it is Luís Sousa. I hope you have enjoyed this episode as much as I have enjoyed the recording of it with Luís here. And again, we're recording here on this March 8th, International Women's Day. And what a perfect day to talk about the 5 muses of Shakespeare. I think that's what I'm going to title the episode, as a matter of fact, Luís. And so thank you again for joining us. Fellow Quillers, don't forget you can find all things Quiller in nature at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com. And if you have anything you'd like to share with us, you can write to contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. We'll leave it at that. And of course, until next time, folks, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.